I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with 11.3, The Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedorov and his followers. Picking up in Chapter 3, The Russian Philosophical Context. Unlike Russian literature, Russian music, or even Russian art, Russian philosophy is little known outside its homeland. This is not because Russians have neglected philosophical speculation, but because they have gone about it in their own way, usually avoiding paths favored by followers of Descartes, Kant, and Mill. Philosophy as passion. Since for most of the 19th century, the study of philosophy in Russian universities was either prohibited or, when permitted, allowed to range only from Plato to Aristotle. Discussion of the accursed questions remained an extracurricular activity. Philosophy in Russia could not be a profession, so it had to be an irrepressible passion, something for small groups behind closed doors, or, when conducted openly, done so in the form of letters, poems, stories, novels, and essays in literary criticism. The major contributions to Russian thought, then, as reflected in the standard anthologies, have been made not by trained academicians, but by gifted amateurs, imaginative writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, literary and social critics, Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, Pisarev, Dobroliubov, wealthy landowners, Kirivsky, Semerin, former horse guardsmen, Komiakov, certified madmen, Shadaev, spiritual pilgrims, Skovoroda, expelled teachers, Solovyov, and frocked and unfrocked priests, Bulgakov, Florensky, Berdyaev. Moreover, not only in the 19th century, but throughout the history of Russian thought, even into the present century, the line between literature and philosophy has never been as sharply drawn as in other traditions. Philosophical belles lettres and belletristic philosophy in Russia have more often been the rule than the exception. From Pushkin, Baratnitsky, Gogol, Tyutchev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy on through Blok, Byali, Ivanov, Pasternak, and Solzhenitsyn, writers whose talents are primarily literary have made contributions to Russian thought, significant enough to justify innumerable studies titled So-and-so Writer as Thinker. And from Chaidev, Kirivsky, Belinsky, Herzen, and Komiakov through Solovyov, Leontiev, Shestov, and Rozanov, pardon my butchering these Russian names, thinkers whose chief gift is for speculation have also demonstrated considerable literary talent. And even when the thinker has lacked genuine literary talent, as in the case of Chernyshevsky, that thinker has still often preferred the novel, poem, or play to the treatise as the vehicle for his or her ideas. And we recall that it was not any of Russia's academic philosophers, but Dostoevsky, from whom Nietzsche said he would learn something. Thus, whereas in the Western intellectual tradition of all Russia's best-known thinkers, perhaps only Solovyov and Berdyaev would be considered genuine philosophers, in Russia, being a lover of wisdom is still often sufficient to qualify. The destiny of Russia. As V.V. Zenkovsky, Berdyaev, and many others who have written on the intellectual history of Russia have observed, in the Russian tradition of speculation, epistemology and pure rationalism have not been preeminent. Instead, Russian philosophy has tended to be unacademic, existential, historiosophic, prophetic, reform-minded, and man-centered. The major questions have been, what are the lessons of history? What is Russia's special role in the world? What is the nature and destiny of man? Who or what is to blame for man's fate? Which is more important, beauty or utility? And as mentioned before, the most frequently asked question of all has been, Shito Dalat, what is to be done? Berdyaev could have been describing Russian thinkers in general when he wrote of himself. Despite the established and venerable tradition of confining philosophy to logic and epistemology, I was never able to conform my mind to such a limitation, or to see any possibility of true philosophical knowledge along these lines. On the contrary, knowledge appeared to me as creative understanding, involving a movement of the spirit, a direction of will, a sensitivity, a search for meaning, a being shaken, elated, disillusioned, and imbued with hope. The great century of Russia's accursed questions began with Pyotr Shadayev, who asked in his first philosophical letter of 1836 what Russia had ever contributed to world civilization, and feared that the answer was that Russia had contributed nothing of value and had presented only a negative example, a living demonstration of how civilization ought not to evolve. For this, the journal that published that letter was shut down, the publisher was exiled to the farthest north, and Shadayev was officially declared insane, although further publication of Shadayev's work was prohibited. His ideas were thoroughly discussed and debated in salons and intellectual circles in both Moscow and St. Petersburg. Out of these debates emerged the long-running argument between the Slavophiles such as Alexander Komiakov, Ivan Kirivsky, and Yuri Samarin, who emphasized what Russia could teach the West, and the Westernizers such as Vissarion Belinsky, Nikolai Ogarev, and Alexander Herzen, who emphasized what Russia should learn from the West. Fedorov and the Cosmists eventually offer a synthesis of Westernizer and Slavophile positions, welcoming Western scientific and technological advances, but turning them towards Slavophile goals of communal wholeness, unifying activity, and spiritual consensus, all contained in the well-known Slavophile concept of sobornost. In his unfinished work, Apology of a Madman, Shadayev suggests that Russia does not have an historic mission, but in order to fulfill that mission, she must follow some inner path of development of her own, instead of attempting to imitate and overtake the West. Fedorov and the later Cosmists believe that their projects, combining science and spirituality, represent precisely that inner integrative path that Russia should follow in order to be true to her historic mission. After Shadayev in the 1830s and the original Slavophiles and Westernizers in the 1840s, the dominant intellectual forces to emerge were the neo-Westernist radical socialists and populists in the 1860s and 1870s, and the neo-Slavophile pan-Slavists and revanchist Orthodox monarchists in the 1880s and 1890s. And again, the Cosmists share goals with all these earlier groups and attempt to resolve the apparent contradictions. Fedorov, Solyevov, and Bulgakov, for example, all propose models of an all-embracing communal life more radical than the socialist communes proposed by Dmitry Pisarev, Nikolai Dobrolyubov, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, or any of the other radicals of the 1860s. Similarly, the awakening of the Russian people that Fedorov and other cosmic thinkers call for is more profound than anything dreamed by Peter Lavrov and the agrarian populist Narodniki, from the word narod, people, movement, of the 1870s and 1880s. The difference between a total moral, spiritual, physical rebirth, as advocated by the Cosmists, and an appeal to join a mass movement for mere regime change and social reform, as advocated for by the Narodniki. The appeal for universal Christianity with Russia at the center, as developed by Fedorov and other Cosmists, reaches farther and is more radically inclusive than the late 19th century pan-Slavist calls for Russia to ride to the aid of their Balkan ethnic cousins and defend Slavic Christendom from the Turk, and Fedorov's defense of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality presents a profound and radical extension of the revenant slogan most often associated with those arch-enemies of all Russian progressives, then and now, Sergei Uvarov and Konstantin Pobedonostsov. For Fedorov and the Cosmists who follow his lead, all humans, even temporary political enemies, are related, share the same common goal of eternal life, and have one and only one common enemy, death. And the Russian autocrat and the Russian Orthodox Church destined to save the world are not those now in existence, not those exalted by Pobedonostov and the Neo-Slavophile revanchists, but the Samarashevets, the Russian autocrat as he ought to be, the distant future autocrat, a model of regulation of nature and self-control, and the Orthodox Church as it ought to be in the distant future, the sponsoring institution for the activity of restoring wholeness and unity to the living and life to the dead. Thought as a call for action. A constant feature of the Russian tradition of speculation, linking it to Cosmism, is the emphasis on thought as a call to action. It is no accident that the Russians adopted and attempted to implement the ideas of Marx more immediately and thoroughly than did other Europeans, or that Bakunin, the apostle of anarchistic action throughout Europe, came from high Russian aristocracy. From the early exchange of philosophical letters between Ivan IV the Terrible and his renegade former friend and subject Prince Ivan Kurbsky, through Shadev's agonized meditations on Russia's mission, through the Slavophile westernizer debates on which direction Russia should follow, through Dostoevsky's dialectics on freedom and subjugation, through Tolstoy's search for a truth to live by, and up to Solzhenitsyn's philosophical letters to the rulers of Russia, the focus has characteristically been not on the theoretical nature of this or that concept, but on the actions required by this or that ideal. Not the nature of reality, but the consequences of any given model of reality. In the Russian tradition, it is not enough to ask what is true. We must go on to ask what must we do about it. Thus, long embedded in Russian philosophy, as we have seen in Fedorov's view of science, is a tendency to view every ology as an opportunity for energy, every discussion of what is as an invitation to consider how to accomplish what ought to be. And this insistence on not merely observing and defining, but radically transforming the given world, is a further example of Cosmism's thaumaturgical tendencies, of an eschatological historiography that links Russian Cosmism of the 19th and 20th centuries to the age-old practice of magic and alchemy. The totalitarian cast of mind. Another feature of Russian thought relevant to Cosmism is its totalitarian cast, its tendency towards total universal solutions. With exceptions such as Dostoevsky's Underground Man and most of Berdiaev, Russian thinkers, whether Westernist or Slavophile, liberal or conservative in orientation, tend to place the good of the whole community above the freedom of the individual to go his or her independent way. Shadaev, for example, argues in his first letter that unity is paramount, and that one virtue of Christianity is that it can captivate our being whether we wish to do so or not. Nothing more clearly indicates the divine origin of this religion than this aspect of absolute universality, which allows it to penetrate people's souls in all possible ways, to possess souls without their being aware of it, to dominate them, to subjugate them, even when they resist it the most. And in his third letter, he goes so far as to suggest that our goal as creatures endowed with reason should be to rid ourselves of freedom. There is no reason which is not obedient reason. But that is not all. Does man do anything his life long but seek to submit to something? What should happen if man could make himself so submissive that he wholly rid himself of freedom? Clearly, according to what we have said, this would be the highest degree of human perfection. Every movement of his soul would then be produced by the principle which produced all other movements of the world. Thus, instead of being separated from nature as he now is, man would fuse with it. Instead of feeling of his own will, which separates him from the general order of things, which makes him a being apart, he would find the feeling of universal will, or, what is the same thing, the intimate feeling, the profound awareness of his real relation to the whole of creation. To Russian thinkers, Western notions of individual freedom often seem more like willfulness and license than genuine freedom. For Russians, the individual completes himself, becomes whole, and finds true freedom only by becoming part of a greater whole. In Russian thought, as in Russian opera, the dominant sound is more often than that of the mighty chorus than that of Thoreau's solitary independent American hero marching to a different drummer. And like other Russian thinkers, the Cosmists, as we shall see in detail later in this study, are for the most part not interested in compromised positions and partial solutions. The emphasis is always, nearly always, on the universal applicability of the given idea, the totality of the given project, inner and outer nature, as a unified cosmic whole. Thus concludes section 11.3, The Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and his followers. We'll continue next time with section 11.4. I will see you then. Alam.